In the grand halls of Astoria Palace, where centuries of tradition have shaped the destiny of nations, a decision is about to be made that will shock the world. King Edmund Ashworth III, after 30 years on the throne, faces the most difficult choice of his reign. The woman he married for love must step aside for the woman chosen by destiny. Princess Isabella Hartwell, beloved by the people and carrying the hopes of a new generation, is about to rise to a position that will test everything she believes about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of power. But in a monarchy where every gesture is scrutinized and every decision echoes through history, can love survive when the crown demands the ultimate sacrifice? This is the story of three people whose lives will be forever changed by one historic announcement, and a kingdom that will never be the same. What you are about to read will take you inside the private moments, the secret conversations, and the heart-wrenching decisions that led to the most significant royal transition in modern history. From the whispered discussions in palace corridors to the dramatic public announcement that captivated millions, this is the untold story of how duty triumphed over desire, and how sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. The morning mist hung heavy over the gardens of Astoria Palace as King Edmund Ashworth III stood at the tall windows of his private study, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose beds that had been planted by his great-grandmother nearly a century ago. The weight of 30 years on the throne pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible crown, heavier than the actual one that sat locked away in the palace vault. At 58, Edmund carried himself with the dignity expected of a monarch, though those closest to him could see the lines of worry that had deepened around his eyes in recent months. His marriage to Lady Victoria Pemberton had been the scandal of his youth, a love match that had defied palace protocol and captured the hearts of his subjects. Victoria, with her warm smile and genuine care for charitable causes, had won over even the harshest critics who had initially questioned her suitability as queen consort. But today, as Edmund stared out at the perfectly manicured grounds, he knew that the conversation he was about to have would change everything they had built together. The soft knock at his study door came precisely at 9 o'clock, just as he had expected. Princess Isabella Hartwell entered with the grace that had made her a favorite of the international media and the pride of the Astorian people. At 34, she possessed a rare combination of intelligence, compassion, and natural elegance that seemed to embody everything the modern monarchy needed to survive in an increasingly complex world. Isabella had married Prince Alexander, Edmund's eldest son and heir to the throne, in what many called the wedding of the century 8 years ago. Their love story had been genuine and beautiful, captured in photographs that still adorn magazine covers around the world. More importantly, Isabella had embraced her royal duties with a dedication that impressed even the most traditional members of the palace staff. "Your Majesty," Isabella said, offering a respectful curtsy despite the informal nature of their meeting. "You wish to see me?" Edmund gestured to the comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace, away from the formal desk that dominated one side of the room. This conversation required warmth, not the cold distance of official business. "Please, Isabella, sit with me. And, given what we need to discuss, I think Edmund will suffice for now." Isabella's expression showed a flicker of surprise, but she settled into the chair with the poise that had become second nature to her over the years of royal training. She folded her hands in her lap, waiting patiently as Edmund gathered his thoughts. "I've been thinking a great deal about the future of our monarchy," he began, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "About what Astoria needs, and what our people deserve as we move forward into an uncertain world." The princess nodded, her dark eyes reflecting both curiosity and concern. She had noticed the private meetings Edmund had been holding with senior palace advisors, the hushed conversations that seemed to stop whenever she entered a room, the way Victoria had seemed more distant in recent weeks. "The challenges we face today are different from those my father dealt with, or even those I encountered when I first took the throne," Edmund continued. "The people expect more from their royal family now. They want authenticity, connection, and leadership that speaks to their daily lives, not just ceremonial traditions." Isabella leaned forward slightly, recognizing the serious tone that indicated this was more than just a philosophical discussion about the monarchy's future. "I've watched you over these past 8 years, Edmund said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "The way you've connected with people from all walks of life, your work with the Education Reform Initiative, your natural ability to bridge the gap between tradition and progress. You've shown qualities that I believe our kingdom desperately needs." A long pause filled the room, broken only by the distant sound of horses' hooves on the cobblestone courtyard outside. Isabella sensed that Edmund was building towards something momentous, something that would require all of her strength and wisdom to navigate. "I've made a decision that will surprise many people," Edmund finally said, meeting her eyes directly. "When I announce the next phase of succession planning, I intend to designate you as the future queen consort, effective immediately upon my retirement, which I plan to announce within the year." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat as the full implications of what Edmund was suggesting began to sink in. In the traditional line of succession, Victoria would naturally continue as queen consort until Edmund's death, at which point Alexander would become king with Isabella as his queen. But Edmund was proposing something entirely different. He was suggesting that Victoria step aside voluntarily, allowing Isabella to assume the role while both men were still alive and capable of guiding the transition. "Your Majesty, Isabella began, then stopped herself, struggling to find words adequate to the magnitude of what was being proposed. "I know this is unexpected," Edmund said gently, "and I know it raises complicated questions about Victoria, about tradition, about how such a change would be perceived by our subjects and the international community." Isabella's mind raced through the possibilities and problems such a decision would create. Victoria had been a beloved queen consort, dedicating 3 decades of her life to the role with grace and dignity. The suggestion that she would voluntarily step aside seemed almost unthinkable. "Has the queen consort agreed to this?" Isabella asked quietly. Edmund's expression grew more somber. "Victoria and I have been discussing the future extensively. She understands, as I do, that sometimes personal sacrifice is necessary for the greater good of the monarchy and our people." The careful way he phrased his answer told Isabella that the conversations between Edmund and Victoria had been neither easy nor completely resolved. She could only imagine the emotional weight of such discussions between two people who had shared 3 decades of marriage and public service. "I need you to understand," Edmund continued, "that this decision isn't made lightly, nor is it meant to diminish Victoria's contributions. Rather, it's recognition that the monarchy must evolve to remain relevant and effective. Your generation brings perspectives and connections that will be essential for our future." Isabella stood and walked to the window, needing a moment to process what she was hearing. The gardens below looked the same as they had when she entered the room, but she felt as though the entire world had shifted beneath her feet. "What about Alexander?" she asked. "Have you discussed this with him?" "My son understands the responsibilities that come with his position," Edmund replied. "He's always known that difficult decisions would be required of him as future king. This transition would actually strengthen his eventual reign by ensuring that you both have experience in your roles before taking on the full weight of the crown." Isabella turned back to face the king, her expression showing the internal struggle she was experiencing. The role of queen consort was one she had always known she would eventually hold, but the circumstances Edmund was proposing would place her in an unprecedented position. "I would be taking on Victoria's role while she's still alive and capable," Isabella said, voicing the concern that seemed most immediate. "How could I possibly justify that to myself, let alone to the people?" Edmund stood and joined her at the window, looking out at the kingdom that had shaped both of their lives in profound ways. "Because sometimes leadership requires us to make decisions based on what's best for the future, not what's most comfortable for the present," he said. "Victoria herself recognizes that you represent hope for a new generation of historians who need to see their values and concerns reflected in their royal family." The conversation continued for another hour, with Edmund explaining his vision for a gradual transition that would allow both couples to work together in reshaping the monarchy's public image and internal operations. He spoke of Isabella's natural diplomatic skills, her ability to connect with international leaders, and her genuine understanding of the social issues that would define the kingdom's future. Isabella listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the practical implications of such a change. How would it be announced to the public? What role would Victoria play after stepping aside? How would the international diplomatic community respond to such an unprecedented transition? By the time their meeting concluded, Isabella had agreed to consider Edmund's proposal seriously, though she made it clear that she would need time to discuss it with Alexander and to think through all the ramifications. The decision would affect not just their personal lives, but the very nature of how their subjects understood the monarchy. As Isabella left the study, Edmund remained at the window, knowing that he had set in motion events that would test everything he believed about duty, sacrifice, and the future of the crown that had defined his entire adult life. The princess walked through the palace corridors with measured steps, her mind churning with questions and possibilities. Servants and staff members she passed offered respectful nods, unaware that the young woman they had watched grow into her royal role was now contemplating a change that would reshape the very institution they all served. When she reached her private apartments, Isabella found Alexander reading in their sitting room, surrounded by the comfortable furniture and personal photographs that made this part of the palace feel like home. He looked up as she entered, immediately recognizing the expression on her face that indicated something significant had occurred. "The meeting with father was eventful, I take it?" Alexander asked, setting aside his book and giving her his full attention. Isabella settled beside him on the sofa, taking his hand in hers as she began to explain the extraordinary conversation she had just experienced. As she spoke, she watched Alexander's expression shift from surprise to concern to careful consideration. The future of their family, their marriage, and their kingdom now hung in the balance, waiting for decisions that would echo through generations of Asturian history. The evening light filtered through the tall windows of the Queen's private sitting room as Victoria Pemberton carefully arranged fresh flowers in a crystal vase that had been a wedding gift from the people of Astoria 30 years ago. Her movements were precise and graceful, developed over decades of public appearances where every gesture was observed and analyzed by photographers and royal watchers around the world. At 55, Victoria retained the elegance that had first caught King Edmund's attention when they met at a charity gala in London. Her auburn hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was pulled back in a style that was both sophisticated and approachable. But those who knew her well could see the tension in her shoulders and the careful control in her expression that suggested she was wrestling with thoughts far heavier than the choice of flowers for her private rooms. The soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. She turned to see Edmund entering quietly, his own expression reflecting the weight of the conversations they had been having over the past several weeks. "The flowers are beautiful," he said, though both of them knew he hadn't come to discuss her decorating choices. Victoria set down the remaining blooms and faced her husband, the man who had chosen love over royal protocol when he insisted on marrying her despite the initial opposition from palace advisors and constitutional experts who questioned whether a commoner, even one from a distinguished family, was suitable to be queen consort. "I spoke with Isabella this morning," Edmund said gently. "She's agreed to consider our proposal, though she naturally has many questions and concerns." Victoria nodded, having expected this update. She had been preparing herself for this moment ever since Edmund first raised the possibility of what he called a transitional succession several months ago. "How did she respond?" Victoria asked, her voice steady despite the emotional complexity of the situation. "With grace and thoughtfulness, as we expected," Edmund replied. "She's concerned about the impact on you, about how such a change would be perceived, and about whether she's truly ready for the responsibilities we're asking her to assume." Victoria moved to the small seating area where she and Edmund had shared countless private conversations over the years of their marriage. The familiarity of the space provided some comfort as they navigated this unprecedented situation. "She should be concerned," Victoria said, settling into her favorite chair. "What we're contemplating goes against centuries of tradition. The role of queen consort isn't something you simply hand over to the next generation while you're still alive and capable." Edmund took the chair across from her, the same arrangement they had used for discussions about state matters, family concerns, and the countless decisions that had shaped their shared reign. "But maybe that's exactly why it needs to happen this way," he said. "Maybe the tradition of waiting for death or complete incapacity before allowing the next generation to lead is exactly what's holding our monarchy back from adapting to the modern world." Victoria studied her husband's face, seeing the genuine conviction behind his words. She had always admired Edmund's willingness to question established practices when he believed change would benefit their kingdom, even when such questioning made others uncomfortable. "Tell me honestly," she said, "is this really about what's best for Astoria, or is this about your concerns regarding my health?" The question hung in the air between them, touching on the issue that had been underlying many of their recent conversations. 6 months ago, Victoria had been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that, while manageable with treatment, had forced her to reduce her public appearances and delegate some of her responsibilities to other members of the royal family. Edmund leaned forward, reaching for her hands. Your health is certainly a consideration, he said honestly. But this decision goes far beyond that. I've watched Isabella over the past 8 years, and I've seen how naturally she connects with people, how instinctively she understands the direction our society is moving. She represents something our people need right now. Victoria felt a complex mix of emotions as she processed his words. Pride in the young woman who had become like a daughter to her, concern about her own legacy, and uncertainty about what role she would play in a monarchy that no longer needed her in the same way. I've spent 3 decades building relationships, establishing programs, representing our kingdom around the world, she said quietly. The thought of stepping away from all of that while I'm still capable of contributing feels like abandoning a calling. Edmund squeezed her hands gently. You wouldn't be abandoning anything. We've discussed this. You would continue your charitable work, your patronages, your involvement in the causes you care about. But you would do so without the formal protocol and constant public scrutiny that comes with being Queen Consort. The idea of reduced public scrutiny held some appeal for Victoria, who had lived under the intense gaze of the media and public for most of her adult life. There were aspects of royal duty that she had performed out of obligation rather than passion, and the prospect of focusing solely on work that genuinely inspired her was not without attraction. What about the public reaction? She asked. How do we explain to people who have watched us for 30 years that I'm voluntarily stepping aside for someone younger? Edmund had been anticipating this question, knowing it represented one of the most significant challenges they would face in implementing such a transition. We frame it as evolution, not replacement, he said. We present it as a planned transition that allows Isabella to grow into her role gradually while benefiting from your guidance and experience. We emphasize that this is about strengthening the monarchy's future, not rejecting its past. Victoria stood and walked to the window that overlooked the private garden where she and Edmund had often taken evening walks during their early years of marriage. The garden had changed over the decades, with new plantings and modifications that reflected their evolving tastes and needs, but it remained fundamentally the same peaceful retreat from public life. I keep thinking about what my mother would say, Victoria admitted. She was so proud when I married you, so excited about the idea of her daughter becoming Queen Consort. The thought of voluntarily giving up that role, while I'm still healthy, feels like disappointing her memory. Edmund joined her at the window, understanding the deep personal connections that made this decision so difficult. Your mother was proud because you embraced a life of service, he said. She would be equally proud to see you making a decision based on what's best for the institution and the people you've served so faithfully. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the gardeners work in the fading light. Both of them understood that this conversation was part of a larger process of coming to terms with a change that would reshape not just their public roles, but their private relationship and sense of purpose. There's something else we need to discuss, Victoria said eventually. If we move forward with this transition, what happens between us personally? How does our marriage adapt to such a fundamental change in our public roles? It was a question that had been weighing on both of their minds, though neither had yet found the courage to address it directly. Their marriage had been built around shared public duties and mutual support in carrying out royal responsibilities. Removing that shared framework would require them to rediscover their relationship in a new context. I think it gives us an opportunity to be husband and wife in a way we haven't been able to since I took the throne, Edmund said thoughtfully. Without the constant protocol and formal requirements, we might actually have more time and freedom to focus on what brought us together in the first place. Victoria turned to study his face, searching for any sign that he was saying what he thought she needed to hear rather than expressing his genuine feelings. You really believe that? She asked. I do, he replied without hesitation. I fell in love with Victoria Pemberton, not Queen Consort Victoria. Maybe this transition would allow me to be married to that woman again, instead of always sharing you with the crown. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering practical concerns about timing, public relations strategy, and the complex logistics of transitioning royal responsibilities. They discussed how Victoria's existing charitable patronages would be handled, what ceremonial roles she might continue to play, and how they would work with Isabella to ensure a smooth transfer of duties. By midnight, when they finally made their way to their private chambers, both Edmund and Victoria felt they had reached a tentative understanding about moving forward with the transition. It wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges they hadn't yet anticipated, but they shared a sense that they were making a decision based on love for their kingdom and genuine care for the people who would carry the monarchy into the future. As Victoria prepared for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror and tried to imagine what it would feel like to introduce herself as simply Victoria Ashworth rather than Her Majesty Queen Consort Victoria. The prospect was both frightening and oddly liberating. In the adjoining room, Edmund sat at his desk writing notes about the conversation with Isabella and the ongoing discussions with Victoria. Tomorrow would bring new meetings with advisors, constitutional experts, and family members who would all need to understand and support the decision they were contemplating. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, but Edmund was beginning to believe that perhaps the greatest service he could provide to his kingdom would be ensuring that the next generation was fully prepared to carry that weight with wisdom, grace, and the kind of modern perspective that would keep the monarchy relevant for decades to come. As he turned off the lights and joined Victoria in their bedroom, Edmund felt cautiously optimistic that they were embarking on a path that would strengthen rather than diminish the institution they had both served with dedication for so many years. Prince Alexander Ashworth stood in his private office at Kensington House, staring at the ornate chess set that had belonged to his grandfather. The ivory pieces, carved by master craftsmen nearly a century ago, reminded him of the strategic thinking that royal life required, where every move had consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. At 36, Alexander had spent his entire life preparing for the responsibility of kingship, but nothing had prepared him for the situation his father had just presented to his wife. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany desk where Alexander had been reviewing briefings about his upcoming trade mission to Southeast Asia. The routine diplomatic work that filled much of his schedule seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the monumental decision his family was contemplating. Isabella had returned from her meeting with King Edmund 3 hours ago, and their conversation about the proposed transition had been intense, thoughtful, and ultimately inconclusive. Alexander found himself torn between admiration for his father's bold vision and deep concern about the personal and political ramifications of such an unprecedented move. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and he looked up to see his private secretary, James Morrison, entering with a carefully controlled expression that suggested he was aware that significant discussions were taking place within the royal family. "Your Royal Highness," James said with the formal courtesy he maintained even during their most casual interactions. "Lady Margaret Whitfield has arrived for your scheduled meeting." Alexander nodded, remembering the appointment with his father's most trusted constitutional advisor. Lady Margaret had served the royal family for over 20 years, providing guidance on everything from succession law to public relations strategy. Her presence today was undoubtedly related to the conversations about the proposed transition. "Please show her in, James. And I'd appreciate privacy for the next hour." Lady Margaret entered with the brisk efficiency that had made her invaluable to 3 generations of royals. At 62, she possessed a sharp intellect and deep understanding of both constitutional law and public sentiment that had helped the royal family navigate numerous crises over the decades. "Alexander," she said, dispensing with formal protocol as she often did during private consultations, "I imagine you have questions about your father's proposal." Alexander gestured for her to sit in one of the comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace, away from the formal desk setup that dominated the rest of the office. "I have concerns," he admitted, "about the precedent we'd be setting, about the public reaction, and about what this means for the stability of the monarchy." Lady Margaret opened the leather portfolio she carried and withdrew several documents that Alexander recognized as constitutional research and public opinion analyses. "Your father asked me to research the legal and historical implications of the transition he's proposing," she said. "What I've found is both encouraging and concerning." Alexander leaned forward, ready to absorb whatever analysis she had prepared. "From a constitutional standpoint, there's nothing preventing such a transition," Lady Margaret continued. "The role of Queen Consort is largely ceremonial and customary rather than legally defined. Your father has the authority to restructure royal duties and designations as he sees fit." "But," Alexander prompted, sensing there was more to her assessment. "But there's no historical precedent for anything quite like this," she admitted. "We've had monarchs who abdicated, regents who stepped aside when monarchs came of age, and consorts who died or became incapacitated. We've never had a healthy, capable queen consort voluntarily transfer her role to the next generation." Alexander processed this information, understanding that the lack of precedent could be either an opportunity or a significant problem, depending on how the transition was managed. What about public opinion? He asked. How do we think people would react? Lady Margaret consulted another document in her portfolio. I've commissioned some preliminary research, obviously without revealing the specific situation. What we've found is that public sentiment about the royal family is generally positive, with particularly strong support for Isabella among younger demographics. Alexander wasn't surprised by this finding. Isabella's natural warmth and genuine commitment to social causes had made her extremely popular with the public, particularly with millennials and Gen Z citizens who often viewed the monarchy as an outdated institution. The challenge, Lady Margaret continued, is that people also have tremendous respect and affection for Queen Consort Victoria. Any transition would need to be presented in a way that honors her service and makes clear that this is a positive evolution rather than a rejection of her contributions. Alexander stood and walked to the window that overlooked the palace gardens where he had played as a child under the watchful eyes of royal security. Those simpler times seemed very distant as he contemplated the complex political and personal dynamics of the decision his father was proposing. What about the international implications? He asked. How would other royal families and diplomatic partners view such an unconventional transition? That's perhaps our greatest concern, Lady Margaret said honestly. The European royal families tend to be quite traditional, and some might view this as an unstable or inappropriate departure from established protocols. However, the younger generation of royals in Sweden, Belgium, and the Netherlands might actually see it as innovative and forward-thinking. Alexander appreciated Lady Margaret's candid assessment, knowing that sugarcoating potential problems would serve no one's interests in such a significant decision. There's something else to consider, she added. If this transition goes well, it could position Astoria as a leader in modernizing the monarchy for the 21st century. Other royal families might eventually follow our example. And if it goes poorly, then we risk undermining public confidence in the stability and judgment of the royal family at a time when monarchies around the world are already under pressure to justify their continued relevance. The weight of this assessment settled over Alexander as he considered how much was at stake in the decision they were contemplating. It wasn't just about his family's personal circumstances, but about the future of an institution that had provided stability and continuity for their nation for over 8 centuries. I need to ask you something personal, Lady Margaret, Alexander said. Do you think my father is making this proposal because he genuinely believes it's best for the monarchy, or because he's concerned about Victoria's health? Lady Margaret considered her words carefully before responding. I believe your father's motivations are complex and multifaceted. Yes, the Queen Consort's health situation has influenced his thinking. But I've also observed his genuine admiration for Isabella's abilities and his growing conviction that the monarchy needs to adapt more rapidly to changing social expectations. Alexander nodded, appreciating her honest assessment of the family dynamics at play. What would you recommend? He asked. If you decide to move forward, the transition would need to be planned meticulously, Lady Margaret said. We'd need a comprehensive public relations strategy, careful coordination with government officials, and a timeline that allows for gradual adjustment of responsibilities. She opened another folder and showed Alexander a preliminary timeline she had developed. I'd suggest a 6-month preparation period, during which Isabella would gradually take on more of the Queen Consort's traditional duties while Victoria remains visible but begins to focus more on her personal charitable interests. Alexander studied the timeline, noting how carefully Lady Margaret had structured the transition to minimize public confusion and maximize the appearance of institutional stability. The announcement would be crucial, she continued. It would need to emphasize continuity, positive change, and the voluntary nature of Victoria's decision. We'd want to present this as the royal family proactively preparing for the future rather than reacting to any crisis or problem. Their conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from ceremonial protocols to media strategy. By the time Lady Margaret departed, Alexander had a much clearer understanding of both the opportunities and risks associated with his father's proposal. As evening approached, Alexander made his way back to the private apartments he shared with Isabella, knowing that they needed to continue the conversation they had begun earlier in the day. The decision they were contemplating would affect not just their public roles, but their personal relationship and their plans for starting a family. He found Isabella in their sitting room, surrounded by books and papers that suggested she had been conducting her own research into the historical and constitutional aspects of the proposed transition. She looked up as he entered, her expression showing the same mixture of excitement and apprehension that he felt. I've been reading about Queen Mary's role during the transition from King George V to King George VI, Isabella said. It's not exactly the same situation, but it's interesting to see how the royal family has managed significant changes in the past. Alexander sat beside her, noting the careful way she had organized her research materials. One of the qualities he most admired about Isabella was her methodical approach to understanding complex situations before making important decisions. Lady Margaret shared some preliminary analysis of the legal and public relations aspects, he said. The constitutional framework would support such a transition, but the public relations challenges would be significant. Isabella set aside the book she had been reading and turned to face him directly. I keep thinking about Victoria, she said. She's been so gracious and supportive to me from the moment we married. The idea of essentially taking over her role while she's still perfectly capable feels presumptuous. Alexander understood her concern, having wrestled with similar feelings about the appropriateness of such an unconventional succession. But I also think about the opportunities, Isabella continued. The chance to gradually grow into the role while having both Edmund's and Victoria's guidance, the possibility of bringing new perspectives to royal duties, the potential for modernizing how the monarchy connects with people. They spent the evening discussing every aspect of the decision they faced, from the practical implications for their daily lives to the broader questions about what kind of royal family they wanted to be for the next generation of historians. By midnight, when they finally prepared for bed, Alexander and Isabella had reached a tentative agreement to support the transition, provided that Victoria genuinely felt comfortable with the arrangement and that adequate time was given to ensure a smooth, respectful change of responsibilities. As Alexander lay awake thinking about the conversation, he realized that his father's proposal represented more than just a change in royal protocol. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that the monarchy could evolve thoughtfully and deliberately, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining the dignity and stability that made it valuable to their society. The prince who had spent his life preparing to inherit the throne was now preparing to help his wife step into a role that would test everything they both understood about duty, tradition, and the delicate balance between personal desires and public service. The grand ballroom at Astoria Palace had been transformed into a press conference venue, with rows of chairs arranged precisely for the invited journalists, constitutional experts, and diplomatic representatives who would witness what palace officials were calling a significant announcement regarding the future of the royal family. Camera crews from major networks around the world had spent the morning setting up equipment, their technical preparations creating an atmosphere of barely contained anticipation. Sir Robert Caldwell, the palace's director of communications, stood at the back of the ballroom reviewing his notes one final time. In his 15 years of managing royal public relations, he had overseen announcements of births, deaths, marriages, and scandals, but nothing had prepared him for the delicate challenge of presenting the transition that would be revealed today. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of careful preparation. Constitutional lawyers had reviewed every aspect of the proposed change, ensuring that all legal requirements were satisfied. Public relations specialists had crafted messaging that would emphasize positive evolution while respecting the dignity of all parties involved. Most importantly, the royal family themselves had spent countless hours in private discussions, making sure that everyone was genuinely committed to the path they were about to announce publicly. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the double doors at the front of the ballroom opened, and King Edmund entered, followed by Queen Consort Victoria, Prince Alexander, and Princess Isabella. The assembled media rose respectfully as the royal family took their places at a specially arranged seating area that had been designed to project both formality and warmth. Edmund stepped forward to the podium that had been positioned to allow clear sightlines for photographers and camera operators. He wore the navy blue suit that had become his signature for important public appearances, and his expression conveyed the gravity and thoughtfulness that characterized his approach to significant royal announcements. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the press, distinguished guests, Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sophisticated sound system. Thank you for joining us today for what I believe will be remembered as a historic moment in the evolution of our monarchy. The room fell completely silent except for the soft clicking of camera shutters as photographers captured the moment. Edmund paused, allowing the significance of his opening words to register with the audience. For 30 years, Queen Consort Victoria and I have had the privilege of serving the people of Astoria together, he continued. We have weathered challenges, celebrated triumphs, and worked to modernize our monarchy while preserving the traditions that give it meaning and stability. Edmund glanced toward Victoria, who sat with the perfect posture and composed expression she had mastered over decades of public appearances. Her subtle nod encouraged him to continue with the announcement they had all spent so much time preparing. Today, I am pleased to announce a planned transition that represents our commitment to ensuring that the royal family continues to serve our nation effectively for generations to come, Edmund said. After extensive consultation and careful consideration, Queen Consort Victoria and I have decided to begin a gradual transition of royal responsibilities that will prepare Princess Isabella for her future role as Queen Consort. The murmur that rippled through the audience was immediately suppressed as journalists and observers strained to understand the full implications of what they were hearing. Several reporters began typing rapidly on their laptops, while others leaned forward in their chairs, anticipating additional details. This transition will take place over the next 8 months, Edmund continued, during which Princess Isabella will gradually assume many of the ceremonial and diplomatic responsibilities traditionally carried out by the Queen Consort, while continuing to benefit from Victoria's guidance and experience. Edmund paused again, understanding that the next part of his announcement would generate the most intense scrutiny and potential controversy. I want to be absolutely clear that this decision represents evolution, not replacement. Queen Consort Victoria will continue her important charitable work and will remain actively involved in causes that have defined her 3 decades of royal service. However, she will step back from certain formal protocol duties to allow Princess Isabella to grow into her future role while having access to mentorship and support. The king gestured toward Victoria, who rose gracefully and moved to the podium. Her presence commanded immediate attention, and the room became even quieter as she prepared to speak. My dear friends in the media and fellow citizens of Astoria, Victoria began, her voice warm but resolute. The decision that Edmund has announced today is one that I support wholeheartedly and have been actively involved in planning. She paused, making eye contact with several journalists she had worked with over the years, establishing the personal connection that had always been one of her greatest strengths as a public figure. After 3 decades of serving as your Queen Consort, I have had the extraordinary privilege of witnessing our nation's growth, our people's resilience, and our monarchy's ability to adapt to changing times, Victoria continued. I have also had the joy of watching Princess Isabella develop into a remarkable woman whose dedication to public service and natural ability to connect with people represent exactly the kind of leadership our nation needs. Victoria's words were carefully chosen to emphasize her voluntary participation in the decision while highlighting Isabella's qualifications for the expanded role. This transition allows me to focus more intensively on the charitable organizations and causes that have always been closest to my heart, Victoria said. It also ensures that our monarchy benefits from the fresh perspectives and energy that Princess Isabella brings to royal duties. The Queen Consort returned to her seat, and Princess Isabella approached the podium. At 34, she had grown comfortable with public speaking, but the magnitude of this moment was unlike anything she had previously experienced. Your Majesties, Your Royal Highness, distinguished guests, Isabella began, acknowledging the formal protocol even in this unprecedented situation. I am deeply honored by the confidence that their majesties have placed in me, and I am committed to earning the trust of the Astorian people as I gradually take on expanded responsibilities. Isabella's voice carried a combination of confidence and humility that had endeared her to the public since her marriage to Prince Alexander 8 years earlier. I want to emphasize that this transition is possible only because of the foundation of excellence that Queen Consort Victoria has established over 30 years of dedicated service, Isabella continued. I will be relying heavily on her wisdom, her experience, and her continued guidance as I work to fulfill the responsibilities that come with representing our royal family. She outlined some of the specific areas where she would be taking on expanded duties, including diplomatic receptions, state visits, and leadership of several major charitable initiatives. Her presentation was detailed enough to demonstrate serious preparation while remaining accessible to the general public who would ultimately judge the success or failure of this transition. Prince Alexander concluded the formal presentations with brief remarks emphasizing his support for the transition and his confidence in both his wife's abilities and his stepmother's continued contributions to royal life. The question and answer session that followed was intense but respectful, with journalists probing for details about the timing, motivation, and precedent for such an unconventional change. Edmund, Victoria, Alexander, and Isabella had prepared extensively for this moment, and their responses demonstrated both transparency and unity in their decision-making process. The most challenging questions focused on whether health concerns had influenced the decision, how other royal families might view the transition, and what constitutional experts thought about the precedent being established. The royal family addressed each concern directly, emphasizing that the decision was proactive rather than reactive and that extensive legal and constitutional review had confirmed the appropriateness of their approach. When the formal press conference concluded after 90 minutes, the royal family remained available for additional individual interviews with selected journalists. These more intimate conversations allowed for deeper exploration of the personal and philosophical factors that had influenced their historic decision. Sir Robert Caldwell monitored the immediate media response from his office adjacent to the ballroom, watching as news organizations around the world began broadcasting reports about Astoria's groundbreaking royal transition. Initial reactions were mixed but generally positive, with many commentators praising the royal family's innovative approach to succession planning. Social media responses were immediate and intense, with hashtags related to the announcement trending globally within hours of the press conference. Younger users particularly embraced the idea of Princess Isabella taking on expanded responsibilities, while older demographics expressed more cautious support pending observation of how the transition actually unfolded. By evening, editorial writers for major newspapers were already preparing analysis pieces that would appear in the next day's editions, examining everything from constitutional implications to international diplomatic considerations. The royal family gathered that evening for a private dinner in the palace's family dining room, finally able to speak freely about the day's events without the careful protocol that had governed their public presentations. "I think it went as well as we could have hoped," Edmund said as they shared a meal prepared by the palace kitchen staff, who had been sworn to secrecy about the day's announcement until it became public. Victoria nodded, looking more relaxed than she had appeared in weeks. "The questions were challenging but fair," she said. "I was particularly pleased with how well Isabella handled the inquiries about her readiness for expanded responsibilities." Isabella herself seemed both relieved and energized by the public debut of the transition plan. "The real work begins now," she said. "The announcement was just the beginning of proving that this change will benefit everyone involved." Alexander raised his glass in a quiet toast to his family's courage in undertaking such an unprecedented evolution of their royal roles. As they continued their private celebration, each of them understood that they had crossed a threshold that would reshape not only their personal lives, but the very nature of how the monarchy would function in the 21st century. The announcement had been made. The initial public response had been encouraging, and the real work of implementing the most significant change in royal protocol in generations was about to begin. 6 months after the historic announcement that had captivated audiences around the world, Princess Isabella stood in the ornate mirror of the Queen's dressing room, adjusting the sapphire necklace that had been worn by Asturian queen consorts for over 2 centuries. Today marked the formal conclusion of the transition period, and in just 2 hours, she would participate in the ceremonial transfer that would officially establish her as the new queen consort, while King Edmund remained on the throne. The transformation had been remarkable to witness, both for the royal family and for the Asturian people who had followed every step of the carefully orchestrated transition. What had begun as an unprecedented experiment in royal evolution had developed into a model that constitutional experts from around the world were studying as a potential framework for modernizing monarchies. Isabella's reflection in the mirror showed a woman who had grown visibly into her expanded role over the past months. The confidence that had always characterized her public appearances had deepened into the kind of natural authority that comes from experience and genuine competence. Her work during the transition period had included successful diplomatic missions to 3 countries, leadership of a major education reform initiative, and dozens of public engagements that had consistently drawn enthusiastic crowds. A soft knock at the dressing room door interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Victoria entering with the warm smile that had made the entire transition possible through her gracious support and patient mentoring. "You look absolutely radiant," Victoria said, approaching to help Isabella with the final adjustments to her formal attire. That necklace has never looked more beautiful. Isabella touched the sapphires gently, feeling the weight of history they represented. I keep thinking about all the women who have worn this before me, she said. The responsibility feels overwhelming and inspiring at the same time. Victoria's expression reflected understanding born from her own experience of taking on royal responsibilities 3 decades earlier. The secret, she said, is remembering that the role serves the people, not the other way around. As long as you keep that focus, the rest will follow naturally. The two women had developed an extraordinarily close relationship during the transition period, with Victoria serving as both mentor and friend in helping Isabella navigate the complex world of royal protocol, diplomatic requirements, and public expectations. Their partnership had been one of the most positive aspects of the entire transition, demonstrating that change could happen without creating division or resentment. "Are you ready for this afternoon's ceremony?" Isabella asked, knowing that Victoria would be playing a significant role in the formal transfer of responsibilities. "I've been ready for months," Victoria replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Watching you grow into this role has been one of the greatest privileges of my royal life. I'm excited to see what you accomplish with the platform and opportunities that come with being Queen Consort." The ceremony they were preparing for had been designed to honor both the historic nature of the transition and the continuing importance of tradition in royal life. Constitutional experts, religious leaders, and protocol specialists had worked together to create a program that would satisfy legal requirements while providing meaningful symbolism for the Astrian people. Isabella left the dressing room and made her way through the palace corridors that had become as familiar as her own home over the past 8 years. Servants and staff members she passed offered respectful acknowledgments, but she could sense the excitement and pride they felt about being part of such a historic day. In the grand ballroom where the announcement had been made 6 months earlier, hundreds of invited guests were taking their seats for the ceremony. The guest list included government officials, diplomatic representatives, charitable organization leaders, and citizens who had been selected to represent the diverse communities that made up modern Astoria. King Edmund was already present, wearing the formal uniform that he reserved for the most significant state occasions. His presence provided the constitutional authority necessary for the transition, while his visible support for the change helped reassure any remaining skeptics about the appropriateness of the royal family's decision. Prince Alexander stood near the front of the ballroom, wearing his military dress uniform and the medals he had earned through his service in the Royal Navy. His role in supporting both his wife's transition and his stepmother's gracious adaptation to her new circumstances had earned him considerable respect from constitutional observers and the general public. The ceremony began with traditional music performed by the Royal Symphony Orchestra, creating an atmosphere that balanced reverence for royal tradition with celebration of positive change. Archbishop William Thornton, who had officiated at Alexander and Isabella's wedding 8 years earlier, provided the religious framework that gave spiritual meaning to the transfer of secular responsibilities. When Isabella entered the ballroom, escorted by both King Edmund and Victoria in a gesture that symbolized the continuity and collaboration that had made the transition possible, the assembled guests rose in respectful acknowledgement of the historic moment they were witnessing. The formal portion of the ceremony involved the transfer of specific symbols and responsibilities that had been associated with the role of Queen Consort for centuries. Victoria presented Isabella with the official seal that she would use for royal correspondence, the charter documents for the charitable organizations she would now lead, and the symbolic keys to the royal residences where she would host diplomatic and ceremonial events. But the most meaningful moment came when Victoria removed her own Queen Consort's ring and placed it on Isabella's finger, saying words that had been specially written for this unprecedented occasion. "With this ring, I transfer to you the privilege and responsibility of serving the people of Astoria as their Queen Consort. May you carry this honor with the same dedication and love that has guided those who came before you." Isabella's response, which she had written herself after weeks of careful thought, reflected both her gratitude for the trust being placed in her and her commitment to honoring the legacy she was inheriting. "I accept this responsibility with humility, determination, and deep respect for those who have served before me. I pledge to dedicate my life to the service of our people and the preservation of the values that make our kingdom strong." King Edmund's remarks during the ceremony emphasized the positive evolution that the transition represented for the monarchy and for Astoria as a whole. "Today we demonstrate that tradition and progress can work together," he said. We honor our past while preparing thoughtfully for our future. The ceremony concluded with the singing of the national anthem by the entire assembly, creating a moment of unity that underscored the successful nature of the transition. As the formal proceedings ended, the ballroom was transformed into a reception space where guests could offer personal congratulations to the royal family and celebrate the beginning of Isabella's tenure as queen consort. The reception provided an opportunity for informal conversations that revealed the genuine enthusiasm many people felt about the change. Diplomatic representatives from several countries expressed interest in learning more about how such a transition might be adapted to their own constitutional systems. Charitable organization leaders praised Victoria's continued commitment to the causes she cared about while welcoming Isabella's fresh perspectives on social issues. Perhaps most importantly, the citizens who had been invited to represent various communities throughout Astoria expressed genuine excitement about having a queen consort who they felt understood and shared their concerns about education, economic opportunity, and social justice. As the reception wound down in the early evening, the royal family gathered once more in their private dining room for a quiet celebration with just the four of them. The formal requirements of the day had been completed successfully, but the real significance of what they had accomplished was just beginning to register. I keep thinking about how different this feels from what I expected when I married into the royal family, Isabella said as they shared champagne that had been specially selected for the occasion. I always knew I would eventually become queen consort, but I never imagined it would happen this way, or that it would feel so natural and right. Victoria raised her glass in a toast. To new beginnings, she said, and to the proof that sometimes the most meaningful changes happen when people choose to work together instead of simply following predetermined patterns. Edmund added his own perspective, to the courage to imagine that institutions can evolve while maintaining their essential purpose and values. Alexander concluded their private celebration, to the women who have shown that grace and strength can transform not just individual lives, but entire systems of government and service. As they finished their intimate dinner, each member of the royal family reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed over the past year. The decision that had once seemed risky and unprecedented had evolved into a transformation that strengthened both their personal relationships and their capacity to serve the Astorian people effectively. Isabella spent the evening in her new office, which had been renovated to reflect her personal style while maintaining the dignity appropriate for a queen consort. The walls displayed photographs from her transition period activities, artwork created by students in the education program she championed, and gifts from the various communities she had visited during her gradual assumption of royal duties. Her first official act as queen consort would be a visit to a children's hospital the following morning, followed by a working lunch with education ministers to discuss expansion of literacy programs in rural communities. The schedule reflected her commitment to using her platform for practical improvements in people's lives rather than simply ceremonial appearances. As Isabella prepared for bed on her first night as queen consort, she looked out the window at the palace gardens where she had often walked during the months of preparation for this role. The flowers that had been planted during Victoria's tenure were blooming alongside new varieties that reflected Isabella's own preferences, creating a landscape that honored the past while embracing change. The transformation that had begun with King Edmund's bold vision and Victoria's gracious cooperation had culminated in a new chapter for the Astorian monarchy that promised to serve as a model for thoughtful evolution in the 21st century. What had once seemed impossible had become not just achievable, but inspiring proof that even the most traditional institutions could adapt successfully to changing times when led by people committed to service above personal comfort. The crown had passed to a new generation not through tragedy or crisis, but through careful planning, mutual respect, and shared dedication to the welfare of the people they had all sworn to serve. It was, by any measure, a historic achievement that would be studied and admired for generations to come.